Walk into a medieval church that has stood for 6 or 7 centuries. The oak beams are dark with age, the doors sag slightly on their hinges. Iron straps across the wood are thick with rust. But look closer. Small iron nails are still buried deep in the timber. The same nails that were hammered in when knights still rode across Europe, when the Black Death had not yet arrived, when the world looked very different from today. And somehow, they are still holding. That alone feels strange. Because if you buy a box of cheap nails from a modern hardware store, you might notice something frustrating almost immediately. Strike one slightly wrong with a hammer, and it bends. Tap it into tough wood, and sometimes it snaps or curls sideways. So, how did a nail forged in a smoky medieval workshop, made by hand, one at a time, end up stronger than many nails produced by modern factories? Something about that story does not quite make sense. And there is one detail most people never notice about medieval nails. They were never perfectly straight. They were never perfectly smooth. In fact, they were never meant to be perfect at all. Stand in a modern hardware store for a moment. Rows of boxes, bright labels, galvanized steel nails in neat, identical lines. Each one machine-made, perfectly round, perfectly smooth. Thousands produced every minute somewhere in a roaring factory. We tend to look at something like that and assume a simple story: progress. Our tools are better now, our metals are stronger, our machines are smarter, and compared to the smoky workshops of the Middle Ages, well, it hardly seems like a fair contest. Most people picture medieval metalwork the same way films do: a dim forge, sparks flying, a blacksmith swinging a hammer at glowing iron while sweat runs down his face. Rough tools, rough materials, rough results. If anything, the objects that came out of those workshops should feel crude beside modern hardware. Yet one detail refuses to fit the story. When historians restore medieval buildings, old barns, monastery gates, castle doors, they often find something curious buried deep in the timber. The nails, not replacements, not modern repairs. Original nails, 500 years old, sometimes more, and quite often they are still holding. The wood around them may be cracked with age. The iron may be coated in thick rust, but the nail itself remains locked inside the beam like a stubborn little anchor. Carpenters restoring these buildings notice something odd. Try pulling one of those old nails out, and it often resists far more than expected. Sometimes the wood breaks first. That's a strange result when you think about it. Because modern nails, especially the cheap ones, can bend with a single bad hammer strike. Anyone who has built a deck or repaired a fence has probably watched a new nail curl sideways before it even reaches the wood. So, how did a medieval nail, forged in a smoky village forge with nothing but hammer and anvil, end up gripping timber for centuries? A subtle sign hints at a different truth. Look closely at surviving medieval nails in museum collections or archaeological finds, and something becomes immediately clear. They are not identical, not even close. Some are slightly twisted, some taper unevenly, some look almost crooked. The heads are irregular. The shafts are rarely straight. If you placed a handful of them on a table, you would struggle to find two that truly match. By modern manufacturing standards, they look badly made. Yet they lasted longer than many nails we use today. And that raises a quiet question. If medieval nails appear rough, almost careless, why do they sometimes hold better than the perfectly uniform nails produced by modern industry? The answer, it turns out, begins with a misunderstanding about medieval craftsmanship. And it starts inside the blacksmith's workshop, where something most people never think about was happening day after day. Because for many apprentices, their first real job was not forging swords or horseshoes, it was making nails. Hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. At first, the explanation seems obvious. Medieval nails survived because old buildings were simply well made. Heavy oak beams, thick timber frames, careful carpentry. That is usually where the story stops. But archaeologists who spend time with these buildings begin to notice details that feel slightly unsettling. Pull apart the roof of a medieval barn. Examine the planks of a Viking ship repair. Look closely at the gates of a monastery that has stood since the 1200s. Again and again, the same small objects appear buried in the wood. Nails, thousands of them, and most of them do not look impressive. Their shafts are square rather than round. Their sides are uneven. Some twist slightly along their length. A modern engineer might glance at one and quietly label it defective. Yet one detail refuses to fit the story. Many of these nails are still gripping the timber so tightly that removing them requires splitting the wood itself. Restorers often discover this the hard way. They expect the old metal to crumble. Instead, the wood cracks first. Something about that relationship between nail and timber is different, and historians began to notice another subtle pattern. Medieval carpenters rarely complained about nails splitting wood. That may sound like a small observation, but anyone who has driven a modern round nail into dry wood knows exactly what can happen. Tap too hard, too close to the grain, and the wood suddenly opens along a thin crack that spreads through the board. Yet medieval construction manuals, what few survive, barely mention this problem at all. Which is strange, because medieval builders used enormous quantities of timber, roofs, bridges, ships, fortifications. If their nails constantly split the wood, we would expect complaints. But the historical record stays quiet. A subtle sign hints at a different truth. Look closely at a medieval nail under good light. The shaft is not smooth like a modern nail. It has 4 flat sides, a square spike. That shape alone changes how it behaves inside wood. Instead of forcing the fibers apart in a perfect circle, the sharp edges cut between them. The wood compresses, then grips, almost like the grain is closing around the iron. But that still does not explain everything, because the nails themselves contain another mystery. When metallurgists study surviving examples, they find something unexpected hidden inside the iron. Tiny streaks running along the length of the nail. Lines of glassy material trapped within the metal. Impurities. By modern standards, they should weaken the iron. And yet, evidence suggests the opposite may have happened. Historians still debate exactly why this was so common. But those strange internal fibers begin to point toward the place where the real story begins. Not in the wood, not in the building, but inside the small, smoky workshop of a medieval blacksmith, where apprentices stood for hours beside the fire, hammering glowing metal into shape, and doing the same quiet task again and again and again. If you step into a reconstructed medieval forge today, the first thing you notice is the rhythm. Not the fire, not the smoke, the hammer, tap, turn, strike, tap, turn, strike again. It repeats with a kind of patience that feels almost hypnotic, because for most blacksmith apprentices, the glamorous work, the swords, the ornate hinges, the armor, came much later. Their early years were spent making nails, hundreds each day, sometimes thousands. And something about that repetition shaped not only the metal, but the craftsman himself. Imagine the scene for a moment. A narrow village forge. Charcoal glowing white in the hearth. A pair of bellows wheezing softly as air feeds the fire. An apprentice reaches into the coals with long tongs and pulls out a thin rod of iron, now glowing orange. The iron is soft for only a short time, perhaps half a minute. So the work must be quick. He lays the rod across the anvil and brings down the hammer. One strike stretches the metal. Another thins the shaft. Then the iron is rotated slightly, struck again, rotated again, from every direction. Something about this technique feels deliberate, because the goal is not simply to make the nail thinner. The hammering pulls the metal along its length, stretching it, lengthening its internal structure. Medieval craftsmen would never have described it that way, of course. They did not speak of grain alignment or metallurgical structures, but they watched carefully, and they remembered what worked. A nail hammered evenly from all four sides held better. It bent less easily. It drove into wood with surprising stubbornness. Most people never notice this about surviving nails. Their sides are not smooth. Under good light, faint hammer marks still ripple along the iron, tiny scars from hundreds of blows, each one stretching the metal a little further. Then comes the head. The smith places the thin spike into a small hole in the anvil, called a hardy hole, and strikes the top sharply. The metal mushrooms outward. A rough square head forms, not elegant, not symmetrical, but strong. And in the process, another curious detail appears. Medieval iron itself was rarely pure. In fact, it was often filled with strange glassy streaks trapped inside the metal. Modern metallurgists call these slag inclusions. By today's standards, they look like imperfections, weaknesses, something a modern steel mill would try very hard to remove. Yet, in medieval nails, these tiny impurities stretch along the iron as the hammer falls, long fibers running from head to tip, almost like threads inside the metal. Historians studying them noticed something unexpected. These fibers sometimes helped the nail resist snapping. Instead of breaking suddenly, the iron bent, flexed, held together. It is hard to explain exactly how medieval smiths understood this. Most left no written instructions, but evidence suggests they knew something simple through experience. Certain iron behaved better, certain hammering patterns made stronger nails, and over generations these habits settled quietly into the craft, passed from master to apprentice, from one small forge to another. Still, that was only part of the story, because even a strong nail will fail if it fights against the wood around it. And medieval carpenters discovered something about that relationship too, something hidden in the shape of the nail itself, a detail so ordinary that most people overlook it completely. Now here is where the story turns in an unexpected direction. Because strength alone was never the real secret of medieval nails. A nail can be incredibly strong and still fail if it fights the wood around it. And wood, as every carpenter learns sooner or later, has its own quiet logic. It grows in long fibers, thin strands running through the grain like bundles of threads. Force those fibers apart the wrong way, and the wood splits. Anyone who has driven a modern nail into a dry plank knows the sound, that small cracking noise, the board suddenly opening along the grain. But medieval builders worked with massive oak beams and dense timbers, roof frames, bridges, gates, wood that had taken centuries to grow. If their nails constantly split those beams, construction would have been slow, frustrating, and expensive. Yet one detail refuses to fit the story. The surviving buildings rarely show widespread splitting around their nails. Something about the nails behaved differently, and the clue lies in a shape most people barely notice. Modern nails are round, smooth cylinders pushed into wood like small metal dowels. At first glance, that seems perfectly logical. Machines produce round wire easily. Cut it, sharpen the tip, stamp a head on top. Done. But a round nail does something subtle inside the wood. It forces the fibers outward evenly in every direction, like pushing a pencil into a bundle of straws. The fibers have nowhere to go but apart. Now, look at a medieval nail. Its shaft is square. 4 edges, 4 flat sides, a small detail, but the behavior changes completely. Instead of pushing the fibers apart evenly, the sharp edges slice between them. The nail wedges itself along the natural lines of the grain. Something about this technique feels almost accidental. The smith was not designing an engineering solution. He was simply hammering iron from 4 sides because that was the easiest way to shape it. Yet the result produced a nail that behaved far more gently inside wood. The fibers compressed, then closed back around the iron, gripping it. And there was another strange advantage, because every hand-forged nail was slightly irregular. Some twisted a little. Some narrowed unevenly. At first glance, these look like mistakes, but those tiny imperfections created friction. A machine-made nail slides smoothly through wood. A hand-forged nail drags. The rough sides catch the fibers. The wood presses tightly against the iron. Over time, as the timber slowly swells and shrinks with the seasons, the grip can actually grow stronger. It is hard to explain, yet evidence suggests it happened often. Carpenters restoring medieval buildings sometimes find nails so tightly locked in place that pulling them out requires splitting the beam. And by then, centuries have passed. Historians still debate exactly how intentional all of this was. Did blacksmiths truly understand these advantages? Or were they simply repeating techniques that generations before them had discovered through trial and error? The medieval craftsman rarely wrote down his reasoning. Knowledge lived in hands, not books. A master showed an apprentice how to strike the iron, where to place the hammer, how to judge the heat of the metal by its color, and slowly, through thousands of nails, the method passed forward. But there is one final piece of the puzzle. Because the iron itself, the raw material coming from medieval furnaces, was unlike the steel we produce today. Messier, less refined, full of strange internal threads. And strangely enough, those imperfections may have helped the nails survive for centuries. Step back for a moment and picture the world that produced those nails. No roaring steel mills, no conveyor belts carrying glowing metal through automated rollers. No laboratories measuring chemical composition to the 3rd decimal place. Just a furnace made of clay and stone. Inside it, iron ore smoldering slowly with charcoal. This was the bloomery furnace, the quiet heart of medieval iron making, and the iron it produced was messy. When the furnace cooled, what emerged was not a clean bar of metal. It was a rough, spongy mass called a bloom. Iron mixed with charcoal ash, bits of stone, and streaks of glassy slag. By modern standards, it looked terrible, full of impurities, full of flaws. A modern steel plant would reject material like that immediately. Yet medieval blacksmiths did something remarkable with it. They hammered it, again and again. Each blow squeezed the molten slag out of the iron. Not completely, never completely, but enough to push it into long, thin streaks running through the metal. Most people never notice this about surviving iron artifacts. Under a microscope, medieval iron often looks fibrous. Tiny threads stretching through the metal like strands of wood grain. And something curious happens when iron contains these threads. Instead of snapping suddenly like brittle steel, it tends to bend, flex, hold together. Historians still debate exactly how much medieval craftsmen understood this behavior. They did not describe it with modern metallurgical language, but they certainly observed the results. Iron that had been hammered thoroughly behaved better. Iron worked too cold could crack. Iron worked carefully, patiently, became tougher. Those lessons were not written in books. They were remembered in the rhythm of the forge. Tap, turn, strike, day after day. And through that rhythm, the medieval nail slowly took shape. A square shaft stretched by hammer blows, a rough surface that gripped the wood, fibers of slag running through the iron, resisting sudden breaks. None of this looked impressive by modern industrial standards. In fact, to a factory engineer, it might appear inefficient, even primitive. But that judgment misses something important. Modern manufacturing chases consistency. Every nail identical, every surface smooth, every chemical impurity removed. Efficiency demands it. Yet those ancient nails carried small irregularities that modern industry learned to eliminate. Hammer marks, slight twists, fibers inside the iron, details that looked like imperfections. Yet sometimes, quietly, those imperfections helped the nail survive centuries. So, the next time you stand in an old timber building, perhaps a medieval church, or a barn whose beams have darkened with age, look closely at the iron buried in the wood. The nails are often still there. Rusty, crooked, uneven, hardly impressive. But they are still holding the structure together long after the hands that forged them have disappeared from history. And that leaves us with a small lingering question. Did medieval craftsmen truly understand the hidden strengths of their materials, or did centuries of patient hammering simply preserve a few accidental secrets that modern industry forgot along the way?